Ever heard the saying, fake it till you make it? Well, today we're diving into something that takes that idea to a whole new level.
Oh,
Hypersigils.
interesting.
We've got some fascinating articles and discussions all about how storytelling,
Okay.
especially in our digital world, might actually be shaping reality itself.
It's a bit like planting a seed, an idea,
Right.
and then tending to it so it grows into something real.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But let's back up for a sec. How would you define, hypersigil for someone who's hearing this for the first time?
Imagine a feedback loop between who you are on the inside and how you present yourself to the world, especially through creative things like stories or even your online profile. That's the essence of a hypersigil.
So my carefully crafted Instagram persona could be a hypersigil. I'm not sure if I should be flattered or freaked out.
Well, think about it this way. You choose what to share, how to portray yourself. That creates a narrative, and that narrative can have a real impact on how people see you, and even how you see yourself. That's the feedback loop in action.
Okay, now you've got me thinking about all this perfectly posed vacation photos. But where did this whole hypersigil idea even come from?
The term was actually coined by Grant Morrison, a comic book writer known for weaving some pretty out-there concepts into his work. He was deeply into esoteric ideas, things like chaos magic and sigils, which are basically symbols charged with intention.
Hold on, charged with intention. We're getting a bit mystical here. What does that even mean?
Think of it like this. You focus your will and energy on a specific goal, and then you imbue that energy into a symbol, a story, a work of art. It becomes a sort of focal point for your desire.
So Morrison took this concept of sigils and gave it a modern, almost like technological twist.
Exactly. He described a hypersigil as a sigil extended through the fourth dimension.
Okay.
Now, the fourth dimension might sound a bit sci-fi, but it's basically talking about time. He saw hypersigils as narratives that unfold over time, influencing reality as they go.
And Morrison actually claimed that his own comic book series, The Invisibles, was a 6-year-long hypersigil, right? Didn't he say it completely reshaped his life?
That's right, and that's a key point. The feedback loop. You create this narrative, put it out into the world, and then how people react to it, how it influences your own actions, all of that feeds back into the hypersigil, strengthening it. It becomes this self-perpetuating cycle.
Okay, so that's Morrison's take, but is he the only one who's written about this? Was he some lone voice in the wilderness?
Not quite. Another important figure in all of this is Clintron Finley. He brought in the cybernetics angle.
Cybernetics? You mean like robots and artificial intelligence? What's that got to do with hypersigils?
Well, cybernetics is actually a broader field than that. It's about systems, feedback loops, and how information flows. Finley saw these principles at play in our online interactions, especially how we construct our digital identities.
So are you saying that my Facebook profile is like a cyborg version of an ancient magical symbol?
Maybe not exactly a cyborg, but Finley did see those early social media profiles, like the ones people were obsessed with on MySpace, as unintentional hypersigils.
Hold on, unintentional? You're saying people were shaping their reality without even realizing it?
That's the thing about hypersigils. They can be deliberate, like Morrison's comic, or they could be more subtle, almost accidental. But the principle is the same. The stories we tell, the images we project, they all contribute to a narrative that can have real-world effects.
Okay, this is getting pretty deep. So if we step back from Morrison and Finley for a second, can you give me a more down-to-earth example of how this hypersigil thing might work in someone's life?
Imagine someone who's always struggled with shyness. They decide to create a bolder, more outgoing persona online. They start posting about things they're passionate about, engaging in discussions, maybe even trying out some lighthearted humor.
So they're basically playing the role of their ideal self.
Exactly. And here's where the feedback loop kicks in. As people respond positively to this online persona, it starts to boost their confidence. They begin to internalize those positive interactions.
So the act of pretending to be more confident actually starts to make them more confident in real life.
Precisely. It's not just about the online interactions, but also the internal shift that happens. The line between the persona and their real self starts to blur.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. But, some folks might say this is all just a placebo effect. What would you say to that?
That's a fair point, and there's definitely an element of self-suggestion at play. But think about it this way. Placebos work because we believe they will. Our beliefs have a powerful impact on our reality. And hypersigils tap into that power using storytelling and creative expression to shape those beliefs.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could get really interesting. But before we go any further, I have to ask, Are there any downsides to this? Could this backfire on someone?
That's an important question, and it's where we need to get into the ethical considerations of hypersigils, because the potential for misuse is definitely there.
All right, so we've established that hypersigils can be powerful, but also potentially risky. Before we dive into the ethics of it all, I'm curious, how does someone, intentionally create a hypersigil? Is it as simple as writing down your goals and calling it a day?
It's a bit more involved than that. Remember, it's all about imbuing a narrative with intention and energy.
Right.
Think of it like this. You're not just writing a story, you're crafting an experience, one that you'll actively participate in.
So it's not passive, like just reading a book or watching a movie.
Exactly. You need to be an active participant in the story you're creating. Let's say your goal is to become more confident, as we discussed earlier. You wouldn't just write, "I am confident," and leave it at that.
So I couldn't just make my Instagram bio confident world traveler and hope for the best?
You could try, but a hypersigil is more about the process than the outcome. You need to create a narrative, a story, a world that embodies confidence.
Yeah.
Maybe you write a story about a character who overcomes their shyness and achieves amazing things. Or you design a vision board filled with images that represent confidence to you.
Okay, I'm starting to see the difference. But how do I actually, charge this hypersigil, as you put it?
That's where the feedback loop comes into play. It's about consistently engaging with the narrative you've created.
Okay.
If you wrote that story about a confident character, you'd read it regularly, visualize yourself as that character, maybe even act out scenes in your daily life.
I'm not just writing the story, I'm living it.
In a sense, yes. You're immersing yourself in the narrative, allowing it to influence your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And as you do that, you start to attract experiences that align with that narrative.
It's like the more you believe in the story, the more real it becomes.
Precisely. It's about consciously directing your energy and attention towards the reality you want to create.
This is where I start to wonder about the potential for, manipulation. Could someone use a hypersigil to influence others, not just themselves?
That's a valid concern. And it gets into the ethical considerations we touched on earlier. The power of hypersigils, like any form of power, can be misused. It's important to remember that intention is everything.
So if someone created a hypersigil with the intention of harming someone else?
It's certainly possible, but I'd argue that negativity often backfires. Focusing on harm usually brings more harm into your own life.
That makes sense. But let's say someone has good intentions. They're just using a hypersigil for personal gain, like attracting wealth or fame. Is that still ethical?
That's a complex question. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting those things, but it's important to consider the potential consequences. If your sole focus is on external validation, you might end up neglecting your internal growth.
So it's not just about what you attract, but who you become in the process.
Exactly. It's about using this power responsibly for personal growth and positive transformation, not just material gain.
This reminds me of something we touched on earlier, Arden Lee and her concept of narrative magic. Could you elaborate on how that ties into all of this?
Lee takes this idea of hypersigils and applies it to personal transformation.
Right.
She sees storytelling as a potent form of magic, a way to rewrite the narratives that hold us back and create new ones that empower us.
So it's not just about attracting external things, but also changing our internal stories.
Exactly. Lee talks about using narrative magic to heal old wounds, overcome limiting beliefs, and step into our true potential.
Can you give me an example of how someone might use narrative magic in their own life?
Let's say someone has a deep-seated fear of failure. They could write a story about a character who faces their fear head-on and achieves incredible success. Or they could create a ritual where they symbolically burn a representation of their fear, releasing it from their life.
It sounds almost like therapy, but with a more mystical twist.
There are definitely similarities. Both therapy and narrative magic involve exploring our stories, challenging our limiting beliefs, and creating new narratives that serve us better.
Okay, so we've talked about the how-tos and the ethics of hypersigils, but let's be practical here. How can someone know if it's actually working?
That's where observation and self-awareness come in.
Right.
The effects of hypersigils often manifest in subtle ways, like synchronicities or shifts in your perception.
Synchronicities, you're talking about those weird coincidences that seem almost too good to be true.
Exactly. When you're working with a hypersigil, you might start noticing a series of seemingly random events that align with your intention.
So if I'm working on a hypersigil for confidence, I might suddenly get invited to speak at a conference or meet someone who inspires me.
Precisely. These synchronicities can be signs that the hypersigil is starting to influence your reality.
But couldn't those just be coincidences? How do I know it's not just my imagination running wild?
That's where discernment comes in. Pay attention to how these events make you feel. Do they feel aligned with your intention? Do they inspire you to take action?
So it's not just about the events themselves, but also about the energy and emotions they evoke.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about tuning in to the subtle shifts happening within you and around you. Another sign to look out for is a change in your perception. You might start to see the world differently, notice new opportunities, or feel a surge of creativity.
So it's not just about external changes, but also internal shifts in my mindset and awareness.
Precisely. Hypersigils work on multiple levels, influencing both our inner and outer worlds.
This is really making me think about all the times I've dismissed coincidences as mere chance. Maybe there's more to it than we realize. But wouldn't all this be easier if we had some sort of concrete proof that hypersigils work?
I understand the desire for scientific validation, but the nature of hypersigils makes them difficult to study in a traditional sense. They operate in the realm of consciousness, belief, and subjective experience.
So it's more about personal experience and observation than about hard data.
In a way, yes. It's about being open to the possibility that our thoughts and stories have a power that we're only beginning to understand.
Okay, I'm willing to entertain that possibility. But I have to admit, this is a lot to wrap my head around. It feels like we're venturing into uncharted territory here.
That's the exciting part. We're exploring the fringes of human potential, the intersection of magic, psychology, and technology.
You know, it strikes me that a lot of what we've been talking about applies not just to individuals, but also to larger groups of people. Earlier, you mentioned social movements. Could those be seen as a form of collective hypersigil?
Absolutely. Think about how social movements use storytelling and imagery to create a shared narrative, a vision of a better future. They rally people around a common cause, inspiring them to take action.
So when people come together online, sharing stories and images that evoke strong emotions, they're essentially creating a giant collective hypersigil.
Precisely. And the more people who buy into that narrative, the more energy and momentum it gains, shaping the course of events in sometimes unpredictable ways.
This is mind-blowing. It's like we're witnessing the emergence of a new form of magic, powered by technology and fueled by collective belief. But couldn't this same power be used for negative purposes?
Of course. Just as individuals can misuse the power of hypersigils, so too can groups. Think about propaganda, fear-mongering, or any form of manipulation that uses storytelling to control people's beliefs and actions.
So it all comes back to intention and awareness. We need to be mindful of the stories we're creating, both individually and collectively, and the potential impact they can have.
Exactly. The more we understand the mechanics of hypersigils, the more responsibly we can wield their power.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here, from personal transformation to collective movements. Before we move on, can we do a quick recap of the key takeaways for our listeners?
Of course. We've explored how hypersigils, intentional narratives imbued with energy, can be used to manifest change.
We've talked about the importance of active participation, the power of the feedback loop, and the ethical considerations involved.
We've also discussed how to recognize the signs that a hypersigil is working, and how this concept applies not just to individuals, but also to larger groups and social movements.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. But there's one more aspect of hypersigils that I'm particularly curious about: their role in our digital landscape. We touched on this earlier with social media, but I have a feeling there's even more to uncover.
You're absolutely right. The digital realm offers a fertile ground for hypersigils to flourish, and that's where we'll pick up when we return for the final part of our exploration.
Welcome back. So we've talked about how hypersigils can work for individuals and even for entire social movements.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that the digital world is almost like a breeding ground for hypersigils. Can you expand on that? What makes it so different?
Think about it this way. The internet is all about narratives.
Okay.
We're constantly consuming and creating stories, images, and ideas online. It's a breeding ground for hypersigils because it amplifies the feedback loop.
Okay, so the speed and reach of the internet is definitely a factor.
Right.
But how does that play out in real-world examples?
Look at the rise of influencers. They've mastered the art of crafting online personas that resonate with millions of people. They create content that tells a specific story, embodies a certain aesthetic, and evokes strong emotions.
Okay.
And their followers feed into that narrative, with likes, comments, and shares.
It's like they're building these entire worlds around themselves, and we're all invited to participate.
Exactly. And the more we engage with those worlds, the more real they become, both for the influencer and for their audience.
So are you saying that those carefully curated Instagram feeds are basically hypersigils in action?
In many cases, yes. They're deliberately crafting an image, a narrative that they want to project into the world. And their success often hinges on how effectively they can cultivate that hypersigil.
Okay, but influencers are just one example. What about the rest of us? Those of us who aren't trying to become the next big social media star. Are we still creating hypersigils online?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every time we post something online, we're contributing to a narrative.
Right.
It might be a personal narrative about our lives, our beliefs, our experiences,
Right.
or it might be a collective narrative about a social issue, a political movement, or even just a shared interest.
So my tweets about the latest movie I saw, my Facebook posts about my family vacation,
Exactly.
they're all contributing to a hypersigil, even if I'm not consciously trying to.
Exactly. And here's the thing. The more we buy into those online narratives, the more they shape our offline reality.
Can you give me an example of how that might play out?
Imagine someone who spends a lot of time in online communities that promote a certain political ideology.
Okay.
They're constantly exposed to stories and images that reinforce that ideology.
Right.
And they engage in discussions with people who share those beliefs.
So they're surrounded by a very specific narrative, like a very specific worldview.
Exactly. And over time, that narrative can start to seep into their offline life. They might start seeing the world through the lens of that ideology, filtering their experiences through that narrative.
So the online hypersigil is shaping their offline perception. That's a bit unsettling, isn't it? It suggests that we're all susceptible to this kind of influence, even if we're not aware of it.
That's why it's so important to be aware of the narratives we're consuming and creating online. We need to be critical thinkers, questioning the stories we're being told, and being mindful of the stories we're telling ourselves.
Okay, so we need to be more discerning about the information we consume online.
Right.
But what about the stories we create? How can we use this knowledge of hypersigils to intentionally shape our online narratives in a positive way?
It starts with being mindful of our intentions. What message are we trying to convey with our online presence?
Right.
What values do we want to promote? What kind of world do we want to create?
So it's not just about posting random thoughts or selfies.
Right.
It's about crafting a deliberate narrative that reflects our authentic selves.
Exactly. And it's about being mindful of the impact our words and images can have on others. We have the power to inspire, to uplift, to create positive change with our online narratives.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense. It's like we've been given this incredibly powerful tool,
Yeah.
but we haven't quite figured out how to use it responsibly.
That's a great way to put it. We're still in the early stages of understanding the full implications of hypersigils in the digital age. But the more we explore this concept, the more we can harness its power for good.
You know, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by the fact that we've covered so much ground, from ancient magic to modern technology, and yet it all comes back to the power of stories.
That's the beautiful thing about hypersigils. They remind us that we're all storytellers, whether we realize it or not. And those stories have the power to shape our reality in profound ways.
Well, listeners, we've explored the fascinating world of hypersigils, from their origins in chaos magic to their growing influence in our digital landscape. We've delved into how these intentional narratives, woven through storytelling, art, and online personas, can manifest real-world changes. We've also uncovered the potential pitfalls and the importance of mindful creation. But the most crucial takeaway, the one we want you to carry with you, is this. What stories are you telling? Are you crafting your narrative with intention, or are you letting it write itself?
We urge you to consider the power you hold as a storyteller. Examine your online presence, your creative endeavors, even the narratives you repeat to yourself. Recognize the potential for transformation and use this newfound knowledge responsibly.
Who knows, maybe you're already a hypersigil magician without even realizing it. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this mind-bending journey. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep telling your story.